No reira haere mai no mai ki tēnei kōrerorero, ngā mihi mahana ki a koutou. We're delighted that you've come. Thank you. We have a very big attendance from across the board, NGOs, many public service departments and private sector consultants and others. Thank you. These webinars are inspired and prompted by much work that's gone before, particularly IPANS and the Productivity Commission on collaboration. So you should regard this webinar as part of the ongoing conversation about this very important area. But people have been saying to us that they want us to focus on two particular things. One is what shifts are being made in the public service, at the core of the public service, at the center to support collaborative work. So these webinars do focus on that part of the system, the public service part. Second, people have said, let's not talk so much now about barriers and problems and complaints about the public service and failures. Let's try and focus on the practical ideas and shifts that are taking place, which have the potential to contribute to the solutions. But I must be clear, there will be no simple solutions. This is a very complex area and we shouldn't pretend that it's going to be easy, but there are ideas, initiatives, changes, and shifts taking place which have a real potential to contribute to these. So fantastic. We learn and we change and we adapt. I know there are a number of NGOs here, so I just wanted to say that these first two sessions, I haven't got a particular focus on the social sector or the community, although of course it will be covered. The last one does. So it's on better joined up work generally, not just social sector. As I say, there are 3 webinars. The first one, and I won't hold people to this, they can go where they like really, but the first one is really on the harder levers. Things like structures, accountabilities, incentives, which could contribute. The second one is on the softer levers. That's things like capabilities, relationships, leadership. As you can see, we have 3 CEs in that webinar, so they'll be able to talk about it from their point of view. And the third one focuses on the interface between the community, NGOs, iwi, and the public sector. So the speakers have been asked about, loosely, what is the public service doing and has done to better enable collaboration? So you've got an idea about what's happening. The second question that they will cover, not all of them, but they've been asked to think about this. What can happen next? What could be done so that you can be part of the ongoing solution? And the third question is, what are the tricky complexities and trade-offs? And what are the ideas to overcome them? So that means that you can take into account the complexity as you contribute to ongoing solutions, which I know you will. They'll loosely run as follows, these webinars. Each speaker will speak for 10 to 12 minutes, no more, and I may jump in and stop them if they go further, just a warning. Callum and Sheen and Julie, and I know Derek is joining us. So you will have lots of chance for questions. It's not a completely interactive webinar, obviously, with 3 speakers, but there will be lots of chance for questions. If you do have questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box on your Zoom control panel. And please upvote, because that really gives me an opportunity to put questions that are of interest to as many of you as possible. And if you wish to post comments during the session, do use the chat function too. Sorry, that was a very long introduction, but we're at least now getting on to the subject matter. And it's great pleasure to introduce Julie Fry to start, who's actually in New York at the moment, so completely different time of the day. She's a consulting economist who undertook a review of joined up services for the Productivity Commission. And for this review, she looked at recent progress with 18 collaborative social service initiatives in New Zealand. And I think she's going to dig further into those to draw out some of the things that she learned. So, Julie, over to you. Thank you very much.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to start by talking about 2 things that I think the public service has done to better enable collaborative work in Aotearoa. First, the public service has invested in understanding when joined up and collaborative approaches work best and when conventional single provider initiatives are more appropriate. So the Productivity Commission has over the years done some really useful problem definition, framing and analytical work on this, including in the 2015 More Effective Social Services Inquiry. And as a result of that work, we know that conventional single providers make the most sense in certain circumstances. For example, in specialised health services like surgery, or when consistency is really important, so as in the case of delivering core benefits. And we also know from the Commission's work and the work of others that joined up services are often better for people with multiple, complex, long-lasting needs, as might happen in the case of family violence prevention or crisis management. Second, the public service has experimented with different service delivery models. Government has funded joined-up services like Whānau Ora and Manaaki Tairawhiti and the South Auckland Social Wellbeing Board, which are two place-based initiatives. These services have been encouraged by the government to adopt a test and learn approach, and there have been some really positive results. Many of the service recipients who have used these services, the people with complex needs, say that they prefer these services where they have a trusted relationship with providers, and they like being active partners in designing the solutions to the challenges that they face. Now, one thing that happens when you provide more effective services for people is that often unmet needs come to light. And I think this is actually a really good thing, because people who have opted out of engaging with conventional services or standard services are now opting back in and getting the help that they need. So that's a positive. Now, there have been some challenges with these experimental service delivery models. And Together Alone, I wrote about Mana Whai Kaha, which is a pilot program in the Mid-Central DHB. It's a disability support navigation service. And the day they got started, they had a 400-person wait list. So the service they were providing was seen by clients to be so much better than the status quo that everybody wanted to be involved. Because they weren't prepared for that, they ended up increasing the ratio of recipients to navigators from a planned 40-1 to 100-1. And that wasn't safe for either providers or the families and clients involved. Another challenge we saw in the Whānau Ora review, there were reports of navigators getting involved in clinical work due to staff shortages. So people who are not qualified to provide clinical support were providing clinical services. There were also stories of conventional services ducking their responsibilities when preferred joined up services like Whānau Ora were made available to people. So there are definitely some issues to work through, but there are also some joined up social services that have been proven to be highly effective. And Together Alone, I wrote about Whangaia Ngā Harakeke, which is a community-driven flax roots approach to family violence prevention and crisis management. There were 3 pilot sites, one in counties Manukau, one in Tairawhiti and Te Huku in Kaitaia. And collectively this year, these 3 sites will receive around $5 million in funding. There are also now additional sites in Dunedin, Whanganui and Waitemata. The Whangaia model involves the New Zealand Police partnering with iwi and community groups, both government agencies and NGOs. And the focus is on taking time to build relationships and trust and being there for whānau. Because it can take many, many instances of police showing up to family harm incidents and quietly saying to victims, "We're here when you need us. This is how to make contact," before people feel comfortable taking them up on that. People will often tell police that they don't want their parent or partner locked up. They want them to get support to help them deal with their anger. Now, obviously, there are times when a custodial sentence is the only appropriate response in situations of family violence, but the Whangaia Ngā Harakeke program looks to address root causes of family violence, and it respects the agency of victims rather than making decisions for them as the default. And we do know, based on very robust evaluation methodologies, that it works. So across those 3 initial sites I mentioned, evaluations have shown reductions in family harm of at least 15% relative to control groups. And in Dunedin, there's a new evaluation which is currently being finalised where that figure was closer to 20%. So these are big improvements. Looking ahead, what can the public service do to further reduce barriers to joined up working? There are two things I want to talk about here. One, I think we should be thinking ahead and planning ahead. As we experiment with these joined up initiatives, we need to be thinking, if this works, then what will we need to have in place? So if a service is trust-based and proves effective, and as a result brings previously unmet need to light, we can't just have service providers going, now what? Because failing to prepare does not just result in some people not getting the services they need, it also damages the very foundations of service effectiveness, namely those trusted relationships and the reputation of the service. And those are the things that lead to the increase in demand. So we need to have a plan to address unmet needs that might emerge when we provide better services. And that plan might involve some or all of the following things. And these are all examples that providers have experimented with in order to try and manage increasing need in response to better services. One is having tightly geographically ring-fenced service locations. Another possibility is moving funding from conventional services that aren't working for people to collaborative services that are working for people. We might look to have explicit plans in place to build both workforce and service capacity. And related to this, we might think about ensuring there's sufficient funding provision for the services that people are referred on to. One of the issues that came up for mana whaikaha was that there were a lot of people saying they needed respite care or assistance for siblings or other services that navigators were unable to refer them onto because those services either didn't exist or weren't adequately resourced. So those are all important things to think about. Second, I believe we should commit at every organisational level, right from chief executive on down, to following up identified systems level problems with appropriate systems level solutions. While I was researching Together Alone, I came across many examples of people bending the rules in order to make sure that clients got the help they needed. Now, individuals working in the public service should not be putting themselves at risk in order to help their clients. And often that's what doing whatever it takes actually means. I heard about people risking their physical safety. One example was a navigator who, despite the rules of their organisation prohibiting this, got in a car with a client and ended up being beaten up quite severely. There were examples of people experiencing exhaustion and burnout as a result of doing much, much more than they were contracted to do. And there were also examples of people bending the rules and risking their professional reputations. Now, some of these systems problems are widely known and widely acknowledged. They're not a surprise to any of us. The South Auckland Social Wellbeing Board is one of many organisations that has created workarounds so that people who are homeless can register at a GP surgery. You probably know that in New Zealand, if you want to register with a GP, you need a permanent address. So this is obviously something that needs a system solution, and we should fix the system. Now, obviously, it's easy to say that, it's much harder to do. Finally, what are some of the difficult issues facing the public service and how can complex trade-offs be addressed? I'm going to speak briefly about risk and accountability. I know Derek has more to say on this later. One thing I believe is that accountability is easier when there is a single clearly defined service being delivered to a single individual. That doesn't mean it's easy, simply easier. There are criteria and thresholds and checklists to follow. It gets harder when there are multiple flexible adaptive services being delivered to both individuals and whānau over longer timeframes. And so as a public service, we need to keep exploring and testing better ways to manage risk and accountability. So in addition to looking at ways to monitor outcomes, we also need to think about monitoring relationships. And in Together Alone, I mentioned some work that Ken Warren has been doing in this space that's really interesting. We know that the status quo doesn't work for a significant group of people. And at the moment, we tend to act like all the risk is in novel or joined up social services. But there's also considerable risk in having conventional services being funded and failing to deliver results. So in Together Alone, there are many examples of where joined up approaches have faced excessive scrutiny and conventional services, particularly relative to the funding they received, have received very little scrutiny at all. So as the Productivity Commission said back in 2015, we need to stop doing what doesn't work in order to focus on doing what does work. Now that will require improving accountability for both joined up and standard services. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Julie. That's a very positive, and you've stuck very closely to the brief, some practical ideas for going forward. And when we write to all the participants, we will be sending you in the next day or two, perhaps next Monday, the link to the Productivity Commission work, because we think it will expand on the sorts of things Julie has talked about. Thank you so much. I will just put one question now because it's relevant, I think, for you. The question is, what do you think needs to happen for the national rollout of some of these locality-based examples? The one that's mentioned in the question is enabling good lives. But can you answer that, Julie? What's going to be needed to get it scaled up, a national rollout?
I mean, what we've seen where there have been successful expansions or rollouts or repetitions of particular programs, putting time into building those relationships on the ground and getting those foundations solid seems to be absolutely key. So when I talked about the follow-up on the Whangaia program, it was taking secondary locations up to 2 years to get those relationships all lined up, to get everyone on the same page with those shared objectives, to get everyone trying to agree on what they were trying to do. And I think we need to be thinking about resourcing for sure, and we need to be thinking about staffing for sure, but we also need to be clear about what our objectives are and who's involved, and making sure we're all pulling in the same direction. So just those foundational things are important before we start going wider.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll come onto this more, not just in this webinar, but in the next one, when we're going to be particularly focusing on relationships, turnover, trust, which are some of the incredibly important soft skills and capabilities. So Julie, I'd like to thank you very much. Thank you, Bronwyn. I think you've already put up on the chat the link to the Productivity Commission work. We will repeat it when we contact you. It's my absolute pleasure now to introduce Callum Butler. Callum is the Manager Strategy and Innovation at Te Kawa Mataho, and his team is responsible for advising on matters relating to the machinery of government, and he was involved very much in the development of the Public Service Act. But he really is at the core of the centre, and we'll be thinking it's a bit like a kite, if you want to change things at the core that's going to have a big impact, then you really have to do some powerful things at that centre. And I know Callum has got some really interesting things to share with you. So thank you. Over to you, Callum.
Thank you very much, Sheena. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you all for coming to listen to us today. As Sheena says, I work at the Public Service Commission, Te Kawa Mataho, and in one of the policy teams there. And one of our core areas of focus is on the machinery of government. So particularly relevant to this first of the 3 sessions, which is what, as Sheena said, wanting to focus on accountabilities and structures and those sorts of hardwired things that can kind of support collaboration. So there are 2 key initiatives from the Public Service Commission that I want to discuss today in this context, in the context of how do we better support cross-agency collaboration. So, and those 2 things are the System Design Toolkit, or the Toolkit for Shared Problems, which is something that we've developed to help agencies work through solutions to cross-cutting issues. And the second is new models that we've introduced to support cross-agency working under the Public Service Act. And in addition to those two things, I'm going to briefly discuss my kind of perspectives on where we could go next in terms of administrative reform. Quickly before I get into it, though, I just want to caveat this with saying that I'm focused on these structural and hardwired issues because this is the focus of this webinar. I do want to recognise that I fully support the notion that behaviours and culture are equally, if not more important, those kind of soft levers that will be discussed at the next in the series, and also the kind of collaboration outside the public service. But that said, I do think it's also important to get the kind of the high level system settings right, because otherwise we can really constrain collaboration. So without focusing too much on problems and barriers, I just thought it's necessary to kind of set the context a little bit. It's a story that you've all heard before many, many times if you worked in the public service, about our system and how we had these administrative reforms in the 1980s that generated these strong vertical accountabilities and got agencies to focus very tightly on their own areas of responsibility in delivering their individual functions. Obviously, as a downside, this makes cross-agency work a little bit harder because of that strong focus on what the individual agencies are doing. And unfortunately, this also kind of meant that our traditional approach to machinery of government was heavily focused on agency forms and what type of agency would you establish to deliver on a specific set of functions. And obviously, this isn't a great approach when you're trying to deal with the types of complex problems that collaboration is necessary to solve, such as kind of climate change or the complex social issues that Julie's been talking about. You know, creating agencies that have full responsibility for one of those areas isn't going to work because either they won't have the necessary levers or the entity that you create is unwieldy and there are other disconnects to parts of the system that you inevitably create by doing that. And so what we've seen in our public service over time, over almost the last 20, 30 years since those reforms, was a shift to more attempts to support collaboration on those types of problems. And this was a very organic thing that really, like Julie kind of indicates, often happens despite rather than with the support of the system. So there was kind of no guidance from us on what agencies should be doing in this space. And it was really up to individuals who were kind of dedicated to the cause to make things work, which obviously meant that you kind of had a variety of approaches springing up. But so yeah, the first one of these of the initiatives that I wanted to talk about today is the System Design Toolkit, or the Toolkit for Shared Problems, which you can find on our website. And the aim of that was to take those different types of collaborative approaches that kind of sprung up naturally and provide some guidance to agencies on how they might better kind of deliberately think about designing collaborative approaches to working. So I just want to quickly share. Tried this before. Here it is. Sorry. So hopefully you can all see this. Oh. So this is a kind of overview of the toolkit. So it arranges different approaches to cross-agency working into a two-dimensional framework. So the vertical element where you've got those three different levels is kind of the type of problem. So whether it's a policy problem involving a few agencies, an administrative problem that involves most agencies, or a frontline delivery problem, which is the type of kind of issues that Julie's been dealing with, that kind of requires a few agencies to collaborate. And there are a variety of kind of models depicted there. And so the horizontal element of the spectrum ranges from the formality, the different levels of formality of possible arrangements, from a voluntary approach to a structural approach. I mean, in the middle there, you've got the kind of more recent collaborative approaches that we've seen spring up, which, they all have different varying tools that they leverage to strengthen collective ownership and accountability for these issues, which can include cabinet mandates, specific funding arrangements, and or a kind of a dedicated minister. And so what the toolkit does is it provides a range of information to help agencies work through relevant considerations when they're looking to collaborate, including the kind of practical details of how each of these models work. So funding, governance, support, ministerial arrangements, and different incentives to consider, different case studies for where they've been used in the past and what they look like in practice, and when they might be appropriate to use. And so, yeah, the guidance really emphasizes that you start with something that's softer and you look to strengthen it over time as you reach the limitations of what's possible under your initial approach. Obviously, this has really helped us as well in terms of how we think about machinery of government, as it gives us somewhere else to start rather than just jumping straight into a structural solution to machinery of government challenge that we get faced with. And this is available on our website, as I obviously can't get into the full level of detail today. And so I'm sure we can share that with you. The second thing that I wanted to talk about briefly was the Public Service Act 2020, which which I was involved quite heavily in, and which replaced the State Sector Act, which was our previous kind of piece of legislation underpinning how the public service operates. And this Public Service Act, at a high level, it includes a number of features at that kind of the softer cultural end that kind of aim to shift towards a more unified public service. So can encourage collaboration in that way. But more relevant specifically to the discussion today is that it also provides for the establishment of some more formal hardwired cross-agency arrangements than the ones that we originally canvassed in our system design toolkit. And I think that it's important. This is important because, as I kind of indicated before, our collaborative approaches in the past haven't been institutionalized in the same way as our kind of individual agency accountabilities and arrangements. And as a result, they're naturally more difficult to sustain over time. So, Julie's research on collaboration, including the work that Julie's done, kind of finds a number of important success factors, including strong shared goals and dedicated resources for these collaborative ventures. And all of those things are really in our system, or at least prior to the Public Service Act 2020, were all really emphasised under the agency umbrella, the individual agency umbrella. So everything was driven through the agency. So what this Act does is it provides for a couple of new options for how we structure ourselves that aim to kind of put a collective accountability for an issue on the same footing as individual accountabilities that agencies have for their own objectives. So the two models that the Act brings into existence are the Interdepartmental Executive Board and the Interdepartmental Venture. And so what they do is they both have an equivalent set of responsibilities to ministers that mirror those of an individual department. So they put that on the same level. And that's for a group of chief executives rather than an individual one. And they also give you the same sorts of abilities that a department might have to bring resource together, so that you can administer, one of these ventures can administer and use appropriations, and they can employ staff, so it gives them access to that shared resource. So it kind of puts those important aspects of ownership of objectives and of resourcing on the similar footing to what we've previously had solely for the departmental units.
Just a little warning, Callum, probably 2 or 3 more, 2 minutes.
Okay.
We've got some great questions coming. Thank you.
Okay. The detailed kind of arrangements for both of those models kind of reflect their different purposes. So one's the board is the Interdepartmental Executive Board is about policy, and the Interdepartmental Venture is about service delivery. And so there are some slight differences, but broadly they have those core features which I've discussed. We've got 3 interdepartmental executive boards established so far, and I won't have time to get into the details of those, but they're strategic. They focus on strategic planning, which is about resource management reform. There's a board or executive board, and also there's a executive board for the elimination of family violence and sexual violence. And it's a little bit too early to tell how successful the model is going to be over time. But so far, we, as you'd expect, there have been a few implementation challenges that you'd expect, but anecdotally, chief executives have kind of said to us that they felt that the formal nature of the models as compared to some of the softer collective groups they've been involved in the past has really helped to get that collective ownership, which was part of the objective. So some positive signs. Just very, very briefly, knowing that I've had a time warning, the one area where I think we should be looking for to make further gains in terms of administrative reform at that high level is in the area of public finance. So, like I said, our system's all geared towards the departmental unit, and that's the same for the public finance system. So administration of appropriations and how funding's used and reporting and accountability is all done through the department, which means that, you know, despite there being kind of specific cases where we fund collaborative ventures, often those are on a time limited basis, and the vast majority of funding is still done through the departmental unit. And there have been some positive steps to make public finance in the public finance system to support collaboration. So there were some changes in 2013 to allow more flexible use to the Public Finance Act, and Treasury has provided some guidance, but there are also some Treasury working papers that really at a high level canvass the opportunity to go further and look at a different kind of model for funding collaborative ventures that doesn't just kind of try and tweak the standard departmental funding model. So I think I'll just conclude with saying that I think that's an exciting area for us to look into in the future. And welcome any kind of questions later. Thank you very much.
There is actually a question for you right now, and it's top of the list. What are you, which I love an answer to, what are you seeing in regard to the tension between agency accountability and joint accountability and the behaviours and CE staff in practice? Can you answer that? If not, we'll put it at the end. And
that's a really good question. And I think that particularly where we're looking at these arrangements that look at accountabilities at the highest level, like these interdepartmental executive boards and ventures, the purpose of them is really to kind of help overcome that tension, because the core legal accountability of the chief executive, which has existed since those 1980s reforms, is really focused on accountability for their own agency to their own minister.
Is it shifting in practice? Can you see good signs?
I think yes, it is shifting in practice. And like I said, I think that's exactly what I was saying in terms of how we're viewing the success of the new models, is that the chief executives feel like this is a positive step in order to kind of tip that balance a bit more. So it's obviously always going to be a challenge to get chief executives to kind of take the or agencies writ large, to get people working in agencies to take their collective accountabilities as seriously as their individual ones. But I think that this model helps to shift it in that direction, and that's the anecdotes that we've heard. So yes.
Good move. We'll have to watch it and push for it. Now, there are lots of interesting questions coming up about evaluation and others, but they're for all panelists. So I think the best thing is to move to Derek. Now, Derek Gill is an IPAN's board member and has a research associate with IGPS and NZIR. He's research joint working and has great practice as extensive practice as a practitioner too. Now, Derek is recovering from COVID and has connection difficulties. So he'll probably be relieved when I said, Derek, I really need you to stick to 9 or 10 minutes, no more. And welcome. Thank you very much, Callum. Thank you, Derek.
Right. So am I live?
Yes, you're live, whether you're alive.
Right. Thank you, Sheena, and the other panelists. So we were asked to think about the shifts, and when I thought about the shifts, I think it's really important to distinguish between shifts at the system level and at the network or the collaborative structure level. So I'm going to break my comments into starting at the network level and then moving on to the system level. And as Sheena said, my perspective is that as kind of a pracademic. So as a practitioner, I've been involved in some extremely rewarding high performance networks. I've also watched high performance networks collapse relatively short periods of time, watched them wither and die. And then as a researcher, I worked with some colleagues at School of Government at Victoria, and we did kind of what's called grounded theory. So we went out and we asked practitioners what was important and what made a difference. And I'll come to that when we talk about the system stuff, because for someone like me with mainly a central agency background, it was a real eye-opener. But starting at the network level, at the level of the joint working, there's an article in Public Sector, and I laid out sort of what I think are the 5 key questions that you have to grapple with as part of network governance, and I'm going to make points under each. And so they're around sort of in plain English, why, with whom, how, on what, and using what structure. So on why, it's really important to keep in mind the kind of participation constraint, that it's got to be a win-win. There's no point having a cabinet manual that volunteers chief executives to work nicely together. It's not a win-win. Then it will generate a series of smile and nod meetings, which I've been in plenty of those in my career. And a particularly salutary example of that for me was the Trans-Tasman Therapeutics Agency, for those of you that have an institutional memory, a joint regulator between New Zealand and Australia. And it didn't matter that we had a treaty with Australia, that it was #1 priority for the Trans-Tasman agenda. The value proposition had been eroded for the Australians, and they just didn't play ball, and it eventually fell over. So kind of mandate is always trumped by shared goals. And Julie talked about the importance of shared goals and commitments. So that kind of understanding that sweet spot is just fundamental. Beyond the why is the question of who. And there, the Europeans have this notion of variable geometry. I think that's quite useful in thinking about who you get engaged in to what level. I did some work in international regulatory space, and one issue was passport funds. So kind of, with fund managers could shift across jurisdiction. What was interesting about that was that there was a core group, and others joined and others left. And it seemed to me that was a really good way of handling the problem. So rather than trying to bring everyone in and face the convoy problem of moving at the pace of the slowest, was you build a coalition of the willing and then have people opt in. And I think kind of, we shouldn't. So kind of, I think you've got to think quite hard for some of these boards about what you're asking CEs to sign up to, actually, because variable geometry is really important. The other part of the who that's really came through the research that we did at School of Government was the importance of guardian angels. Who's the champion? Who's got the kind of smarts to know how to manage in the space? Because it's a really different way to managing from a vertical output-based kind of horizontal vertical structure that and it's about being a sponsor of a network is about being a guardian of a process, creating the space, opening it up to possibilities, setting and resetting. It's not it's an agile way of working rather than kind of a waterfall way of working. And a good example of that in my experience is GREG, the Government Regulatory Network. So this is something that came out of the Productivity Commission report. We looked at structures, as I understand it, but we ended up with a network. And it's gone through good times and it's been through some troubled waters. But the key to the sustainability of the GREG has been that it's been a guardian angel in Keith Manch, who's seen it through good times and bad. And those guardian angel roles are really important. And it doesn't seem to me the system acknowledges or rewards those at all. I think that's a good point for discussion at the next workshop when we think about some of the leadership issues. The how, and in particular, important thing is dealing with power imbalance. And a good example of that is the Maritime Coordination Centre. So that's where all the agencies in the maritime space put sort of resources on the table. And some agencies like Defence have a lot more assets than others to put on the table. And so you've got a power imbalance problem. And the way that's handled there is they made customs the kind of coordinator of the network because they're seen as an honest broker, no particular agenda, not conflicted. But you really do have to manage that power imbalance. I worked in the justice sector for a while and they managed that the secretariat function was managed really well there. And it was interesting because I was in the social sector network at the same time where the power imbalance wasn't managed well. And One was just, you felt like you'd been taken along. One, you felt you were being part of a network. So kind of managing those power imbalances is really important. And the last of all is which structure, and that's deliberately the last, because it's the, form follows function, and you need to work out what you're trying to do and who you're trying to do it with before you worry about what structures you use. And I quote my own Gill's law there, which is you should use the structure that's the least demanding in order to get the job done. The kind of if a relatively less intense way of working will get the job, then that's all you need to do, because collaborative structures are really difficult to sustain and support and grow going forward. So that's a few kind of points at the network level. But the other thing to think about, obviously, is what is the overall public management system and political and constitutional system we have fit. And both previous speakers talked to that a little bit. When we did the research on joined up government, I had a central agency background, so I was acutely conscious of the potential role for system blockers. And we listened really, really carefully for staff on what stood in the way. The PSA had asked us to look into whether pay differences were important. People talked a lot about, sort of said, well, the appropriation system gets in the way. But really, what came through that research was there were no real showstoppers there. The public management system, as Callan alluded to, didn't exactly encourage this way of working because of its focus on individual agencies and their accountabilities to their ministers. But nor were there any, kind of first order blockers. But I then asked myself the question, well, if we had a free bid here and there were some system changes you could make, what would they do? And so I've come up with one on accountability, two on structure, and one on funding.
Derek, I don't know how quickly you can get through these four. 3 or 4 minutes.
Yeah, that's good. That's 1 minute each. That's all good.
Okay.
So on rethinking out accountability, it seems to me you've got, as a relatively, when I was a public servant and a lead senior public servant in a relatively low rank, with a relatively low ranking minister, I found it really helpful to think about my accountability as being to the Prime Minister, or potentially even to the GG rather than to my minister. And that was particularly when my minister was discouraging me from getting involved in interagency working processes, which the Prime Minister wanted. So I've sometimes, the article I've never written is whether we should reframe our accountability system in terms of making public servants working for their minister, but accountable to the Prime Minister. And we can look to Canada as an example for a Westminster jurisdiction that works in exactly this way. The Prime Minister appoints CEs, and CEs work for the minister, but are accountable to the Prime Minister. And I think it's an interesting way of reframing the accountability. Second thing I'd talk about is structures, and there's two parts to that. There's an old saw in public administration about the government gets just the degree of coordination it deserves. In New Zealand's case, my experience is ministers speak out of both sides of their mouths. They want other agencies to collaborate on their processes, but they're not that keen on their agency collaborating, working on other ministers' priorities. And we have the most extraordinary fragmented ministerial arrangements of any Westminster jurisdiction I know outside of Sri Lanka. I checked last night, we have 73 unique ministerial responsibilities, and that excludes undersecretaries and assistant ministers. So when I worked in the justice sector, we had 7 different ministers with 7 different portfolios and 7 different agendas. And that, included a minister for courts when we last abolished the Ministry for Courts, and I forget when. So actually the justice sector, we've got a remarkably high degree of coordination given the fractured ministerial arrangements. So consolidating ministerial portfolios would make a significant, would make a significant difference to how things work. At the organisational level, the other structural one is the perennial churn of restructuring. If you look at the data, New Zealand has an extraordinarily high rate of restructuring of positions. And kind of the simple example, the kind of perennial example of a new chief executive gets appointed. There's an organizational restructuring. Half the senior management team leaves. And if you think about what you've done to trust and commitment and networks and resilience, you've just broken a whole lot of links. So kind of changing the burden of proof on restructuring to show that you have to really demonstrate that's going to make the boat go faster would make a significant difference. The last one is funding. As I say, in the research that we did, accountability system, the appropriation system wasn't really the issue. I think the big issue is about multi-year commitments. Often we fund networks off club funding arrangements. The funding is 1 or at most 2 years. We need to look at longer term commitment arrangements. Agencies have multi-year baselines. Why can't we give networks multi-year baselines? And that raises the perennial issue of surplus management, where the Treasury for 20 years has failed to grip up a decent surplus management regime. So I think we need to look at funding arrangements that will reinforce the long-term commitments, which is what networks require.
There's a fantastic set of suggestions. I'm so sorry to stop you. We could listen to
That's it. That's
it. Good. Right. So interesting. And I'm going to go straight to the questions, and I'll have to ask one of you to pick up the answer and be very brief. The top one is this one. Does successful sustainable joint working best start at the top or build what's already happening informally at the front line? That is, hardwiring should follow and support rather than try to commence networked working. Callum, can I ask you, do you agree with that? Are we doing that?
Yeah, I specifically agree with the second part, which is the hardwiring should follow and support rather than trying to commence. So that the guidance for our toolkit is always start with a softer approach, and you only want to hardwire things when you know you've got a good thing going and you want to embed it, or you want to you've reached some sort of limit and you kind of need to power it up, if you will. So yeah, so I agree.
Thank you. Julie, I'm going to put the second upvoted question to you. It's disappeared, actually. I'll ask you again, Callum. To what extent can this framework be used to guide shared working, do you think, between government and non-government? Can that framework you presented be used to share shared working between government and non-government? Yeah.
So that framework is specifically focused on arrangements within the public service.
Okay.
So, but that doesn't mean that you can always use, because all of the examples in that framework are about cross-agency work. It doesn't mean that you couldn't use principles from it to kind of inform those.
Thank you. I mean, that would be a good debate to have further with you. Second question about smaller agencies. How can smaller agencies be enabled here? Derek might have an idea, or Julie on this one. How can smaller government agencies progress transformative community-led initiatives when there are restrictive requirements put in place by the agency's monitoring ministries? That's a complicated one. Julie?
I mean, when I see who is really good at adapting, often it is agencies with the most restrictions. They've just got the greatest will to find a way around it, frankly. Like you think of the New Zealand Police, like they have a lot of restrictions, but they're very, very willing to work around them. So maybe that's not the showstopper it looks like.
Thank you, Julie.
Can I add to that? When there's a will, exactly. When there's a will, there's a way. With the research we did, there was extraordinary stuff. It was generally bottom up, sometimes supported top down. But it's if there's a value proposition, if there's and a commitment, then people find ways of making the stuff work. The question is, can we back them to succeed?
Yeah. Thank you both. Right, there's another question. The key ingredients of what this guy has called the secret sauce that creates the environment for successful collective working. I know that you've written quite a lot about this, and we might put the public sector article in when we write to you because it's got quite a lot in it. But just very briefly, particularly, or from any of you, what is the secret sauce that makes this work particularly? One or two things.
It's a different way of working. The fundamental change is a different way of leading, joining and supporting, which involves working across rather than up. And that often it's often more organic.
Yeah.
It's not Gantt chart territory. It's agile.
I think that's a question. Sorry, Callum, after you.
No. I was just going to chime in with my 10 cents, but you go, Sheena.
No, I was just going to say it's a question we can put to the CEs next time. I think I'll be collecting all these questions to brief them. Anyway, Callum, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think I said earlier that I think the two key things that I would say are a strong shared goal objective and a clear one, so that everyone's bought into that, and some form of dedicated resource that's, like Derek's indicated, protected over time and doesn't get whipped out from under you.
Can I just add one thing? I think it's wonderful when people who go into the public service to help people are able to do things that actually help. And I think it's very motivating when these things happen at the flax roots or at the grassroots, when people experiment with collaborating and see that it delivers services that people respond to better. So there's that as well.
Thank you. There's a number of questions that relate to evaluation, and I'd like to put them now, amalgam, but let's go for this one. And Julie, it's sort of for you, really. What are the criteria for good evaluation in complex settings from your perspective? You mentioned evaluation. What are the criteria in the Together Alone work?
So it depended on how far along some of these collaborative initiatives work. Some of them, you couldn't actually assess outcomes yet. You could assess the process. Others, you're in a position to do complete control evaluation. So it's really a horses for courses situation. As you're setting things up, it's good to assess the process as it goes through and see if it's achieving what it's setting out to do. But when you get these things like the family violence programs, and you can actually set one control group against a non-control group and discover these massive differences in outcomes across them, that's wonderful. But you can't expect to do that in things that are just at the formative stages. You have to be prepared to kind of adapt depending on what's going on.
Any other comment on evaluation from either Derek or Callum? That's fine. Oh,
Just some of the cases, they had a kind of a critical friend, someone who walked alongside the process but wasn't directly part of it. And it was a kind of, they were acted like a kind of a conscience and a sounding board. So it's kind of a how would you say, a real-time evaluation.
yep.
Thank
you.
It's to duly summative and formative.
Yes. Now, there's two very interesting questions, which springs, Derek, from you're managing very well with your COVID. Well done, keeping going. It's the guardian angels to champion system change. How can we create system support? Callum, this might be a question for you, but it's a hard one. And there's a second question. How seriously does the public sector take the leadership, networking, and relational work of system conveners who play a crucial part in complex networks? This is definitely a question for the CEs, but Callum, can you have a go at that, please?
Yes, sure. I mean, I think that part of the shift to an increased focus on working across agencies rather than within silos has been on leadership. And so, I mean, an example of where the public service has emphasised leadership as a way of working, as a way of promoting effective cross-agency working, is with a different approach to regional leadership that's being trialled. So out of the Ministry for Social Development, there are these regional public service commissioners that have been appointed, and so they take a role at a regional level in providing leadership and joining up across both within the public service and with kind of core stakeholders in the regions, and their role is to look for opportunities to develop shared objectives and bring people together to work around those. So I think that it is something, leadership and kind of relational work is something that's seen as very important.
Any other comments from you two about that issue?
I think it's a fundamental challenge on who we select, how we assess them and how we reward them. I think this stuff often goes under the radar. And guardian angels roles are not rewarded as it stands. What does our leadership capability profiles have to say on this stuff?
I did have a difficult question for you, Callum. which relates to this. I'm just not sure the extent to which chief executives and their performance agreements are made accountable for ensuring collaboration. You don't, I mean, can you answer that?
So one thing that's relevant is that with the new models that we've put in place under the Public Service Act is that the chief executives are treated, the performance of the group is reflected in every chief executive's performance agreement and performance evaluation. So how well the group does is a reflection on all of the members, and it's not about what you did individually, it's about success together. So that is something that's reflected.
I mean, one questioner has said, what are the tangible steps by the centre to unlock the space, create permission for public servants to do this? And I think that's a very good question, which I'm going to warn the chief executive next week that we will ask, because I do think it's very important.
I was going to say, I think that it's that leadership, that soft space where that question is most salient.
Yeah, I think so. There's a fascinating question here. How would this reconcile with accountability to Parliament and the public, which is one of the very tricky questions. That's another one I might put. I mean, and just to finish, because I do need to finish very soon, it's the accountability to the client and how we make absolutely clear that these joint arbor commissioners are delivering to the people who we exist to serve. Julie, I think perhaps you.
And that was our starting point. That's why the Commission started saying we needed to look at joined up services and collaboration, because siloed delivery wasn't working in certain circumstances. So that's where we started, I think.
Yes. And the question that somebody has put, what about accountability to those receiving services, which encapsulate it? Now, we've had a little skate through these lots of interesting questions that I will obviously be taking up. I'm briefing all the CEs. I really appreciate your comments. Yes, the video is recorded. You will be able to share it. There is a comment about how much they appreciated your comments, Derek, and they do want the copy of that paper where you say quite a lot of these things. We will include that. And we will try to write this up, but a lot of appreciation for your input, all three of you. So I think in the interest of people having other things to go to, I will have to stop now. Yes, Joe Williams does have a great job partnership, and that's from our conference. I hope that you will watch that too. That's also on our website. So I think going to the IPANS and the productivity website would be very good things to do from now. I have really enjoyed this. I've learned a lot. I would like to thank Julie and Callum and Derek so much. You've put a lot of time into thinking about this and responding to my very precise recommendations about what I wanted you to talk about. Thank you for being willing to be bossed around, and thank you so much. So all the best wishes to everybody. Haere rā, ngā mihi mahana, kia koutou katoa.